Good morning on this June 17th, 2012. We have another tropical weather video update coming later this afternoon, but we also have a high probability of tornadoes across the northern plains, and that is the focus of this video. As of the first day 1 outlook from the Storm Prediction Center, they have a slight risk out for much of the northern plains, but more specifically there's also a moderate risk, and this is primarily over eastern South Dakota and southwest Minnesota. In terms of the tornado probabilities, they are up to 15%, which is quite high, and you can also notice that this area is also being hatched, which means there is a 10% or greater probability of EF2 or stronger tornadoes within 25 miles of any given point within the hatched area. The Storm Prediction Center is conservative about issuing hatched convective outlooks, so this is something to take note of. In terms of the wind threat, it does exist. And also, more importantly, the hail threat is also there. We've got 45% probabilities across the moderate risk area, and it's 45% hatched, meaning that there is a 10% or greater chance of hail in the size of 2 inches or higher. Now, keep in mind when I say 2 inches, usually for severe thunderstorms to be warned, all you need is 1 inch or greater. So we're talking about very large hail. The current surface depiction shows that temperatures across the Dakotas are in the 50s and low 60s. But in terms of the dew points, they're in the upper 40s and low 50s. Now, temps of this range are not favorable for significant severe weather, but this warm front across central Kansas is going to quickly lift north in the morning and late afternoon hours, and that is going to allow for those surface dew points to creep into the middle and upper 60s. By 1 p.m. this afternoon, an area of low pressure is forecast to develop across central South Dakota, with an adjoining warm front over eastern South Dakota. The greatest chance for surface-based severe storms are going to be just to the west of the warm front and east of the dry line that will develop. And as the warm front continues to bulge more toward the northeast, we do think that the severe potential could continue into the evening and early overnight hours across southern Minnesota and northern Iowa. The 250 millibar jet stream pattern is not conducive for rigorous surface low development across the Dakotas this afternoon, but by 7 p.m. we do see an increase in the westerly winds aloft, which will increase your speed shear. Meanwhile, at 500 millibars, we see that the first trough will soon lift out of Minnesota, so during the morning hours we're actually going to be experiencing negative vorticity advection, which is never a good thing in terms of severe storm potential. But once again, during the mid to late afternoon hours, we see another minor shortwave impulse diving southeast out of Canada, and this is going to set the stage for a secondary surface low formation over the Dakotas. Meanwhile, at 700 millibars, the moisture isn't quite there, so this definitely is not going to be a widespread heavy rainfall event. In fact, it's somewhat unlikely for storms to even initiate across eastern Nebraska, and that is because the temperatures at 10,000 feet are being forecast by the models to exceed 12 degrees Celsius, and if those mid-level temperatures are too warm, then the unstable parcels closer to the surface are not going to be able to rise beyond that layer, and so therefore storms will not be able to fire. But up toward the north, the mid-level temperatures are a little bit cooler, and that is why we think that the greatest probability of severe weather is going to initiate over eastern South Dakota. Furthermore, the surface-based CAPE, which is simply a measure of the instability in the atmosphere, is still exceeding 3,000 joules per kilogram by 7 p.m. tomorrow evening, as far north as Watertown, South Dakota. And the best surface lifted index values are going to be located just to the east of this 996 millibar surface low. So between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. that is going to be your best chance for active severe storms between Sioux Falls and Watertown, and then as we go into the evening hours it will extend into southwest Minnesota. Storms should remain severe as late as roughly 10 p.m. local time. As you can see, at 850 millibars in the early afternoon, the low-level jet is going to be somewhat weak, with only values ranging from 30 to 35 knots across the Dakotas into southwest Minnesota. But as we go into 3 p.m., 7 p.m., and 10 p.m., this low-level jet will strengthen to beyond 50 to 60 knots, which should prolong the threat even if it does become mainly wind damage related. In fact, the vertical wind shear should increase throughout the late afternoon and into the early evening hours, and it looks like the shear will remain in place across southern Minnesota and northern Iowa throughout the overnight. This is the forecast at 1 a.m. for the 0 to 3 kilometer helicity, and it is extremely high across southern Minnesota, even as far east as Rochester, Minnesota, in fact, and the same goes for the 0 to 1 kilometer helicity. And bulk shear values, they've been forecast to be in excess of 50 knots throughout the late afternoon, and even through 1 a.m. they still appear to be over 50 knots. So any storms that can remain discrete, or even if they're embedded within a squall line by this late in the overnight period, they still have the potential to become supercellular and even tornadic. So the moral of the story is that everyone living within this slight risk needs to be storm ready as we go into later this afternoon and during the evening hours. As of right now, it looks like the best severe storm potential, including the risk of isolated strong tornadoes, is going to be near and just to the north of Interstate 90. And as we progress into the late overnight period, even interests in southeast Minnesota and northeast Iowa need to be prepared, and this would be a good time to at least turn on those NOAA weather radios. That way, if you have to go to sleep, you will still be alerted if severe storms move into your county. So be prepared, and that's all there really is to this event. And stay tuned to 28storms.com for more updates on this developing weather story as we go into the overnight period. And of course, we have another tropical weather update video coming later this afternoon.